Welcome to the Stanford MBA session on your journey and preparing for a career off the beaten path. My name is Lisa Janangeli, and I'm a director of MBA admissions at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, or the GSB as we affectionately refer to it. I'm also an alumna of the program as well, and I'm delighted to be joined by some of my fellow alumni today who will share a bit more about their experiences. But here's what to expect from today's session. We'll talk a little bit about where your journey might take you. You'll have an opportunity to meet our panelists. I'll start us off with a little bit of questions and answers to get us going. And then we really want to spend some time answering your questions as well. So at any point, again, feel free to submit your questions in that Q&A box. If you see a question that someone else has asked that you also particularly like, you can click on that little thumbs up symbol, which will help vote that up to the top. And we'll have about 55 minutes together today. And hopefully this is just a wonderful opportunity for you to engage with our community and to learn a little bit more about the Stanford GSB experience and how it might enrich your professional opportunities going forward. So let's talk a little bit about where your journey will take you. So here you see some recent stats from our class of 2020. 91% of our students had job offers 3 months after graduation. 445 different organizations hired our MBA students for either summer or full-time opportunities. And 71% of our students were making a career pivot, whether it was an industry, function, and/or location, or some combination of those three. Now, oftentimes when we think of MBAs, we think of some of those typical post-MBA industries, so finance, technology, consulting. But I think one of the wonderful things about this session in particular is that it really highlights how flexible an MBA education is and how it can really take you in a number of different directions. You'll note in the class of 2020, 19% of our students immediately went into socially responsible roles, 18% started new ventures, and for the 6th consecutive year, we have record high compensation within the MBA market. So we're also very, very proud of that. But let's take a moment now to meet some of our alumni, some folks whose paths have led them to sort of job opportunities or professional opportunities that are sort of off the beaten path for our MBA students. We'll have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves. Jackie, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, happy to. The GSB was an amazing experience. And prior to grad school, I worked in philanthropy and social entrepreneurship. I ran a couple different nonprofits. And then during graduate school, I got really passionate about women's sexual health market and how to use business to create more equity related to sexual health. So for the first year or so of business school, I explored investing. I worked in venture capital and interned in impact investing in the sexual health market, and was interested in starting a fund at first. And then I became really passionate about discrimination in advertising, where a lot of entrepreneurs couldn't advertise women's health products because they were being misclassified as adult products, despite mass ads being allowed for erectile dysfunction. So I decided to create a nonprofit that does advocacy and policy work to change tech policies. But I'll briefly also mention that what's been amazing about the GSB is that it also creates opportunities to try completely different areas with a lot of amazing support. So since grad school, I've also been delving into investigative journalism, writing, and documentary, and also a lot of law in my work, which it's all been a helpful platform to try new areas.
Great. And Yiming, if you want to continue on.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Yiming Ma, and I was graduated in class of 2018. I'm Chinese Canadian, and after undergrad, I spent 2 years at McKinsey out of the New York office in corporate finance, and then moved to London, where I spent 2 years investing in school chains and for-profit education technology companies out of South Africa and parts of Southeast Asia as well. At GSB, the year before GSB, I actually took a bit of time, and that's where I started writing again. It rekindled kind of my love for something that I never really thought was possible, being a first-generation immigrant. And at GSB, I looked at just broadening my horizons and learning about, what creative fields might look like. And so specifically industry-wise, I looked into media and summered at Sony out of LA. And then after graduation, I joined the Bertelsmann Leadership Development Program. Every year, Bertelsmann, which owns Penguin Random House, the world's largest publisher, takes about 2 to 3 people who do this leadership rotation program. And so I had the opportunity to work across Berlin in Germany, then moved to New York as part of the main publishing office. And then I was the first one to go into Toronto and work out of the Canadian office. So I had a great experience there and really learned a lot about this black box of publishing that, is still a mystery to most writers. And decided, partly due to COVID, to take some time and actually complete my first novel. And so that's something I'm in the process of finalizing at the moment. And it's really a period of transition where I'm looking to get back into the workforce, but at the same time, finalize the draft and prepare that for submission. So it's really been a one-man startup for the last 2 years on this front. And I'm excited to continue along that journey, but also move back into the business field as well.
Great. And Jack, over to you.
Sure. So my background before going to school, I'm from the Midwest originally, had done McKinsey and private equity after undergrad. So in that sense, I was kind of down the middle of the fairway. There were a couple of things made me a little different as I was applying. One, I had done a stint in politics in Chicago. So I worked for the mayor in Chicago. And then my wife and I were applying together, and she had a way cooler and more interesting background. So we ended up somehow both getting in, which was amazing, and attended together. And I think when I was at school, I was looking to sort of zoom out and decide from my 3 jobs what I liked and what I didn't, and sort of decide what I wanted to do long term, and work on moving from sort of entry-level roles in each position to more of a leadership or manager role. And I happened to catch the entrepreneurial bug, and which is common at Stanford, and started spending more and more time with the classmate working on business ideas in agriculture, and ended up founding and running a kind of hybrid investor and operator in sustainable farming. We have farms up and down California and Arizona. So excited to meet everybody today and tell you how awesome our experience was at Stanford.
And Sam.
Hey everybody, Sam Biker. I was very much on the fence about getting an MBA. I had worked for the Obama campaign in 2012 after 2 years of consulting, and it was the best thing I ever did, loved it, thought I wanted to work in the public sector for the rest of my life. And so went to Stanford Law School thinking that I would do that. And law school is very much, it's great in many ways, but it's very much an on the beaten track kind of place. And I realized pretty soon I didn't want to be on that track. And so ended up applying to the GSB, which I had never thought I would do, and did a joint degree. And it ended up that the business school was far and away the sort of more impactful and meaningful and empowering part of that. So I used it to really explore. I didn't really know what I wanted to do coming in. And I ended up, after 2 years, and thanks to a ton of help from classmates and professors and staff, ended up starting a public interest law firm. So, like Jack, sort of on the, in some ways that is a common path, got the entrepreneurship bug, started a, for-profit venture-backed startup, but we're a licensed law firm, we're a B Corp, and almost all our work is helping disabled people get government benefits. And we just hired our 20th employee, and I could never have done it without Stanford. So excited to share.
Emily, over to you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Emily Eliason. I'm an 06 grad at the GSB. And prior to the GSB, I worked in the early days of digital marketing. I worked for a small market research firm as well. And I thought I would stay in the digital world. I did my internship at Yahoo, but ended up taking a kind of a more traditional path in brand marketing, working for Clorox after graduation. And I love the work, but I worked mostly on the toilet products and wondered if I could apply my skills for something that I had a little bit more interest in. And actually through a great program that the GSB offers called alumni consulting groups, I was able to get introduced into the wine industry. And I've been doing that now for about the past 15 years. So I'm currently the general manager of a company called Giadesti Wine, and I have three different kind of very, very different components of my job. I do farming, I do wine marketing, and then I also do some philanthropy. So I oversee about 4 ranches, 1,000 acres. We mostly sell grapes, produce and sell grapes. I have started a new wine brand called Giadesti, and the sole purpose of the wine brand is to fund a women's leadership and development program for young women who want to have careers in agriculture. So I run the foundation and the program, and so that's kind of the philanthropy part. And certainly all those different things together never ever would have been able to do or construct or figure out without all of the great skills and experience I got out of the GSB.
And then rounding out the panel, Rebecca, would you like to introduce yourself?
Everyone, it's so fun to hear all these different really wonderful stories. I'm Rebecca, and I am GSB class of 2005, and I grew up in the Sierra foothills on a campground, and was a whitewater rafting guide, and went for the first time to the East Coast for college, and then moved to New York City after college as a Coro fellow, and that's where I would say, became an urbanist and came to love the connection of people in place in an urban environment, not just on the river, and worked in urban development there for a few years, and then came back to California, what I thought was my permanent trip home to California for the GSB, and had an amazing 2 years, which we'll talk more about during Q&A. I spent my summer as the White House Office of Management and Budget. I'd been working a lot with local governments in New York City and Charlotte, across the Eastern Seaboard, really. And I wanted to see what community development policy looked like at more of the 30,000 foot level. Then decided that was way too ivory tower for me, and I needed to get more into the numbers. And so I went to Goldman Sachs for 7 years in public sector and infrastructure banking in New York, and then came back to San Francisco and left there to work for Mayor Ed Lee in San Francisco on public-private partnerships and infrastructure related financing initially in San Francisco. Rapidly pivoted to what became the most important issue when I was there, which was housing. Called up a lot of GSB classmates to say, tell me everything you know about real estate. Despite what it says here, my first job wasn't really in real estate. And that's where I founded and then spun off the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is the nonprofit lending investing fund that I run now. And we invest in affordable housing preservation and production in the Bay Area.
Great. Well, a wonderful and eclectic group of panelists here. So again, to our audience members, feel free to go to that Q&A box and type in any questions that you would like to ask our panelists. I'll get us started though with a handful of questions. And let's see, the first question I'll pose to Rebecca and Yiming. Why an MBA and why specifically Stanford? Rebecca, would you like to start?
Sure. So I would say, why an MBA? I went to undergraduate at Brown, which I think I share that with another panelist. Yeah. And you have full freedom, which is kind of scary at Brown. There's no set majors, there's no core there's no core curriculum. And I didn't take an econ, math, investing, like none of it, none of those things. I was fully focused on public health, developing the burden of disease in developing countries. And in my first job, working in urban development and public-private partnerships, things like Brooklyn Bridge Park and the High Line in New York City, realized pretty quickly that in order to get things done that I really cared about at the local level, having more of that finance, real estate, negotiations, business skill set was really important. And but I knew that the way I love to learn is very relationship focused, and it's a lot about the people, and I really care a lot about leadership and community. And so that those two things seemed like that led me to an MBA. I knew that I wanted to be in California. Place is really important to me. Stanford, I knew I wanted to be in the Bay Area. And so that was a big driver behind Stanford. I wanted to be in the place where I wanted to put in roots. And I also really loved the public management program at Stanford, because that intersection between the public and private sectors has been a big focus for me.
Yiming, how about you?
Yeah, I'll start off with my undergrad as well. I went to school in Canada, which is relatively uncommon, but I'm a Canadian, and my school program was actually based a lot on the Harvard case study method. So my university, the Richard Ivey School of Business, is actually the second largest producer of case studies in the world behind Harvard. So it's exactly the opposite of Brown in many ways, right? What Rebecca was saying, we didn't have that much flexibility. All our class was taught versus cases. And we didn't have that much choice because it started really in the third year. And I knew I wanted to go back to school again and broaden my horizons. And out of all the programs, it was clear to me that Stanford was the best for me. And then, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the big thing for me at the time was that it was the right time. I had spent 2 years in New York out of McKinsey, so I had gotten, that experience already. And I was honestly a little bit burnt out. I had been leading these impact investments, and I think I went to travel across 30 countries in 2 years or something ridiculous like that. I was flying all over, spending a lot of time in parts of Africa looking at deals. And I knew that, okay, this feels like the right time to go back to school, recharge, and learn a lot of different things and consider if I do want to pivot. Specifically, I was in London at the time, and I wanted to make that transition back to North America, where my family is. Tactically, my GMATs, I had scored well, but they were about to expire. 4 years had passed, and so this was the year. And when I looked at schools, Stanford was just clearly the one that I was interested in. I had worked with founders for a couple of years. I had that entrepreneurial itch and still really wanted to build something. And at the time, because I was investing in education, there was a dual education MBA program that I was considering. I knew that there was a lot of flexibility or opportunities to take classes across the street, and culture-wise, with this focus on empathy and being able to work on the soft skills in addition to the hard skills, it was a bit of a no-brainer. So out of all the schools I applied to, by far Stanford was the one that I was excited to join.
If anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to chime in at any point too. Well, I'll go to the next question here, and maybe Jackie, you can start us off, and Rebecca, if you have comments, or Emily as well, feel free to chime in. But were there any academic courses at Stanford that kind of forced you to stretch yourself in new ways, or maybe helped enable your success today? Jackie, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, definitely. One of the most helpful courses for me was a winning writing course. Stanford has a lecturer who for 35 years, he's been an editor with the New York Times, and he's helped between 10 and 12 different Pulitzer Prize winning articles. And we have him as not just a teacher of our writing class, but as an incredible mentor and friend. He really gets to know the students. And so I took his class, and he sent an op-ed that I wrote to the New York Times, which ended up being published a week or two after I graduated. And that was about discrimination and toward women's sexual wellness businesses. He also brought Nick Kristof to our class and set up a call between me and like one of the most famous journalists, which was incredible. And the faculty really want to help you succeed. So he's right now helping as a recommender on a fellowship. So I loved that course. I also really liked, we have a professor named Laura Arriaga Andreessen who created a Women in Leadership course and has a longtime philanthropy course. But outside of her class, she would have dinners at her house with Ariana Huffington and Darren Walker. And I think I spent every week at her house at some point because she was such an incredible mentor. The other two quickly I'll mention is I really liked there were two classes about impact investing that I took. And then we also had a class about how to negotiate term sheets as an angel investor or venture capitalist, which I think for classmates that were going to go work at a VC firm might have been less relevant. But for those that wanted to do more entrepreneurial investing, the term sheet classes mattered in particular. And the faculty would normally charge thousands of dollars an hour as a consultant, but you got to have as office hours for free as a student or included in tuition.
Rebecca, over to you. Were there any academic experiences that stand out?
Yeah, so I was in the inaugural class for a class that's still going and has grown called Designing for Extreme Affordability. And that was basically, we were partnered with a specific community-based organization. In this case, it was in Southern India, and focused on, over the course of the semester, working with engineering students and other students across, depending on kind of who came in, law students across the campus, on coming up with a business plan for and prototyping a water system, in this case, for farmers for less than $1 a day. And that was like my first start of it, like that I still think about that in launching the Housing Accelerator Fund, and it was before design thinking was like so much the thing, and rapid iterations and fail fast. It was like very early edge, which I think you often get, which is so awesome at the GSB, like the earliest edge thinking and approach to how do we think and create things and work together across different sectors in different ways. And so I loved that class, and it will definitely echo what Jackie said about the access overall to the professors and the faculty dinners. I have a beloved professor, Jim Van Horn, who taught corporate finance for decades, which is another favorite class of mine. I still think about it every board that I sit on when I actually understand how the income statement and the cash flow statement and the balance sheet all fit together. I thank Jim Van Horn for that, and especially at running my own organization now, and we still send each other cards every holiday season, and like he writes a lot in them. So I think those kinds of connections that you can build with the professors is really a highlight also.
Emily, how about you? Anything that stood out from an academic class or experience?
All of those. I had some commonalities with what Jackie and Rebecca had said, and completely agree. The only one that I would add that I found incredibly impactful was touchy-feely. And so at the GSB, we have a course that is nicknamed touchy-feely. It's called Interpersonal Dynamics. And in large part, it's kind of group therapy with a bunch of MBA students, which is kind of scary. And it tends to be one of the most impactful classes that folks have. I think, for me, Stanford was so it was great to have so many classes where there were nuts and bolts learning, right? Learning finance. Similar to Rebecca, I have a liberal arts background. So that was really important for me to get some of that experience, understanding logistics, understanding modeling and marketing. But, ultimately, I think Stanford does such a good job developing leaders. And that's really what that class is about. It's kind of hard to describe, but it is one that I think a lot of people get something out of. It's very unique to Stanford. And that was one that I got a lot out of. And honestly, every day, every week, there's something that comes up that I learned in touchy-feely.
Great. All right, this next question I'll pose to Jack and then send over to Yiming. Were there any Stanford clubs or extracurricular activities that you participated in that maybe helped you explore or think about new career paths or interests that you had? Jack, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, I came in with kind of a big company background in consulting and private equity firm, and even in politics, I worked for a large organization, and I was really interested in exploring doing something again in politics. So I spent some time in the government and politics group, and like, for example, we went and like knocked on doors in Nevada, which was really cool. I also spent some time in the entrepreneurship type clubs in food and ag, where I ended up working. And I think that sort of morphed over time into a more and more just like the informal extracurricular that's very common of working on, whether it's some kind of side project that's professional in nature or starting a company or things like that, that many of my classmates were doing simultaneous with school. And I think the club sort of provided the foundation for that, where you're meeting other people that have shared interests. And then my experience was, over the 2 years, it became more and more real and more time intensive, and kind of led into what I'm doing now. So the clubs were super helpful for me to just explore spaces that I didn't know as well, or find people with shared interests. And then the other extracurricular thing I was going to mention is, maybe this is outside of the scope of this question, but we did a few GSTs and other travel that were just massively important for us to feel like a closer connection with some of our classmates. I think we kind of sort of met everyone quickly, and it's 400 people on, right when you get there, and can be a little overwhelming. But then traveling for a couple weeks with a smaller group of 10 or 20 really forged some bonds that my wife and I still talk to the people that we went to some of these trips with. So I don't know that that's quite in the scope of extracurriculars, but it was really important to our experience.
Yeah, those global study trips, I think, are highlights for many students. Yiming, over to you.
Yeah, so I was involved in our Arts, Media, and Entertainment Club. I ended up organizing and leading the Future of Media conference that we have every year, my first year, and moderating some panels on it. So Scooter Braun came during our year, who's the main agent for Justin Bieber. And honestly, I learned way more about how he kind of fell out of favor and then came back through the roast than I ever thought I would. But in addition to clubs, I ended up attending a ton of talks throughout campus. So not just at the GSB, but often in other fields. So in particular, whenever authors came, like George Saunders, Anthony Doyer, I had the chance to listen to these people who never came to Canada in particular, and got to meet some of them as well. And some of those conversations I had and advice I got made me more confident to ultimately, invest in myself and invest in this dream that I always had. And then one other thing that I'd add in terms of extracurriculars, it was related to a course I took in anthropology and psychiatry as part of Stanford. But I ended up spending 8 weeks working with formerly homeless adults in San Mateo on improv therapy. And so every week we'd carpool over and work with these adults who are in various shapes in terms of their mental health. And it was a really, really impactful experience for me. And I was able to apply a lot of what I learned, not just in that class, but from GSB, to trying to connect with these people, and something I always bring with me.
Thank you. This next question, Sam, I'll have you kick it off, and then maybe we'll go over to Jackie next. But starting with you, Sam, how did you find career support at the Stanford GSB? Did you leverage the Career Management Center or any of our other centers, like our Center for Entrepreneurial Studies or Center for Social Innovation, or other parts of the campus? How did you kind of go about that career support process?
Yeah, I'll give a big pitch for this. One thing I didn't expect, the GSB's, Lisa, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the GSB's staff to student ratio is crazy. It felt 1-to-1. It was probably 3 or 4-to-1, but it was, there are so many fantastic people whose job is to provide student support. And so those 3 centers Lisa listed, I think I used all of them. Entrepreneurial Studies coordinates a bunch of really great classes and does a bunch of research on starting startups that I as a lawyer, read in great detail before starting a company. The CMC is amazing. I think, I remember law school had, there was the law firm people who told you how to get a law firm job, and there was the like public interest people who told you how to get like one of 3 types of public interest jobs. GSB had, 17 different specialties you could select from. Grace Yokoi on their team, I remember I spent way too much time with her just being like, can I start a startup? This seems insane. Like, and she really helped give me the confidence to do that. And it was the general vibe was just such a choose your own adventure. And like, they were so great. The staff have such a reservoir of knowledge about who good alumni are to talk to, what good classes are to take. It really meant a lot to me.
Jackie, how about over to you?
Yeah, that's amazing. I also used all of the centers you mentioned. The Center for Social Innovation was fantastic. They had a fellowship between your first and second years that a lot of students did, or a number of students did, that were creating social entrepreneurial ventures. And then I coupled that with a fellowship, an internship where you could work for an impact organization, and I worked in impact investing, and there was tons of funding for both of those. I still talk to the staff pretty regularly from Center for Social Innovation on mentorship, and they're so helpful. I also found that the peer support incredibly helpful for career, especially because like Lisa mentioned, I think about 1/5 of classmates start their own venture. And so while you could absolutely go into consulting or finance, I didn't feel any pressure to not do something entrepreneurial because there were tons of other students starting new things. And so it didn't feel as crazy or scary since everyone else was bootstrapping or fundraising. And then a couple more, the career center was really helpful. Especially in my first year, I was interested in venture capital and investing, and I had no investing experience and had come from the nonprofit world. And the staff was so helpful at understanding the world of investing and how to couch your experience in ways where you could get opportunities. A professor, Rob Siegel, let me work with his venture capital fund to get exposure during school. There was also an accelerator called StartX where you could get financial aid and accelerator wraparound support. And then the last thing I'll mention is that for people that go into the nonprofit sector or the public sector, there's loan forgiveness, which is really helpful. So I receive probably like $9,000 a year now to repay my loans, which is super helpful, and it's not taxed. And that's also really helpful for pursuing a career in social entrepreneurship.
Great, thank you. This next question, Jack, I'll maybe have you kick us off, and then over to Rebecca next, and anyone else who wants to chime in, because I know this was a popular one, but how have you leveraged your classmates, alumni, faculty, or the Stanford network more broadly, either professionally speaking or even just personally speaking? Jack, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way like Sam brought up how powerful the GSB was in starting his business, totally feel the same way, from meeting people in my industry to advice on how to set up my company to I've hired a couple GSBers the years behind me. I think maybe like one very like tangible thing is on fundraising. So I'd say somewhere between like 20 and 50 million of fundraising has been from Stanford, either classmates, referrals from classmates, and other alumni. So like it's been massively impactful to me across the board, from advice to hiring to fundraising to all sorts of ways. So there's just no way my business and my career would be where it was if I hadn't started the business while I was at the GSP.
Rebecca?
I echo all of those things. And I think I would say in general, one of the things that maybe attracts people to Stanford and the GSB, but then is really the seeds are watered when you're there, is a level of comfort and openness to reaching out to your classmates with questions, for help at the moments when you need it, to celebrate their successes, that at a level that I don't see in many other communities, especially of that size. So I think that there's just a base level of care and a sense of community that's created and further cultivated within the class that really stays with you, so that it's like, I would say in any specific situation, personal, professional, my top 5 phone numbers that I would call different situation is probably going to be somebody who I know from the GSB. And I mean, I have a few great friends who were now parents at the same school. We go for weekly runs together with some of them. I met my husband at the GSB, so that's pretty transformational. And I think then specifically, particularly for me at career transition points, that's when I kind of reached out beyond the closest concentric circle and tapped into kind of a broader network. I have a GSB alum from many years from before my class who's on my board right now. So those kind of moments, I think there's such a deep, great network, and people have always been really happy to help.
I can also chime in if there's time. And I love everything you shared, Rebecca. I was going to add, there's a program that student organized at the GSB called Talk, where students give about a 40-minute talk about anything in their lives. And I found that incredibly helpful because people know what you care about and can support you the rest of your time. When I was at the GSB, I knew I wanted to work in women's sexual wellness and sex tech, which was absolutely terrifying for me because it was a very stigmatized area, and I didn't know anyone else with an MBA that was going into that path. Although now this year, 6 Harvard and Stanford MBAs have reached out to me that are working in women's sex tech, which is so exciting 2 years later. But I felt that it was a great practice ground to be talking about topics that terrified me, both in class and in talk and socially, and really prepared me to get the confidence to then write a New York Times op-ed about those subjects. And now I have no problem talking about them, whether it's in a sex discrimination lawsuit or a meeting with pretty much anyone. But it without those 2 years in a safe space, I don't know how I would have done that. And then as an alum, you have so many WhatsApp groups where we have a women's founder group that meets monthly. We have entrepreneur groups, we have Bay Area groups. And so you can always send a question like, I need a documentary lawyer, or I'm researching competitors in this market, and everyone will know all the CEOs in some startup space. We just had a classmate of mine that a year out of school successfully led a shareholder activist approach to get 3 sustainability experts on the board of ExxonMobil to move ExxonMobil to more sustainable directions. And we had a whole webinar where he talked to all of our classmates off the record about their strategies and learning. So we're still very much in contact personally and professionally. And I also found, as a woman at the GSB pursuing those areas I shared about, men were so helpful. Classmates connected me with book publishers because they thought you should write a book about these subjects. And really, men as well as women were just incredibly personally supportive in a way that meant a lot to me.
Well, let's go to some of the questions from our audience here, because we've had a few submitted now. So here's a question from Michael. He says, wow, incredible to hear all these different experiences. How do you kind of resist getting caught up in the more traditional recruiting tracks in business school, since it can be difficult to balance your passions with kind of practicality and finances? So anyone want to tackle that one?
I could take one stab. I mean, I think my wife and I were both going to school, and so we were both paying a lot of tuition, and I definitely felt that pressure to go. In my case, what I was considering was going back to the firm where I was at, and we ended up taking out some loans and stuff to figure out how to do it. But I will say Stanford was super helpful. There's lots of programs that folks have mentioned about if you're going into nonprofit, there's extra incentives sort of to do that, and lots of fellowships and other things that I know my classmates took advantage of. And I just felt financially, there was a lot of resources there to help figure that out. And then the culture of my class was so, supportive that just in terms of like the FOMO of what you're going to do with your career, I just can't imagine a better place to do something off the beaten path, because so many people were sort of joining you in that. And that alone helped everyone like really do what they were passionate about and not feel sort of pressure to do what everyone else was doing, basically. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd echo what Jack said, and just add briefly, there were a bunch of classes, and all my favorite ones at GSB fit this description, that would have one alum per class period come in and sort of be a guest speaker. You don't really care about them. Sometimes they just talk. And that was really what gave me confidence, because it feels a lot less crazy once you've met 12 people who are like, yeah, I was in your shoes, 2, 5, 10 years ago, and this was scary, and now I did it, here's where I am. And that was so, I would never have gone off the beaten track without that.
Yeah. I also had great advice from a classmate. The first year of GSB, I was deciding whether to do interviews for consulting or not. But I knew that I had these other passions, and she had the idea, give it 6 months or 8 months where you just let yourself fully focus on your entrepreneurial area, and then assess in 6 months. So you can always apply for consulting in your second year of MBA, but set goals for yourself and then see where you're at that point. And 6 months in, I was so in love with my work, and the goals had all shifted and they'd all changed, but you knew there was no going back. So that peer support was incredibly helpful. And on the finances, like I mentioned, the loan forgiveness did help. There were different fellowships that you could apply for. They were obviously competitive, but a couple of my classmates got, I think, $110,000 to create a nonprofit. And there was a few others. There's a few others like that. Plus the network that you're getting is incredibly helpful, like others have mentioned, for their fundraising. So there's ways to bolster the financial opportunities. And I think that it just definitely was a helpful financial investment.
Here's another question. It says, looking back, what's one thing you would do differently during your time at the GSB? Who wants to take that one?
I can try. I think looking back, it was something that was really pounded into us at the GSB. So it wasn't as if the opportunities weren't there, but honestly, just take more risks. It is such a risk-free environment in that way. And it is the opportunity to really have all of these incredible people around you, professors and alums and classmates. And you really have the opportunity to ask all the dumb questions that you want to ask, and just pick people's brains. And I think having, saying that you're a student at the GSB is a huge door opener for talking to all sorts of people. And at the time, I think, it seems a little risky, but really compared to what things are like, in the real world outside of the GSB bubble, it's really a great opportunity to take advantage of having those 2 years to just experiment and play around and just talk to a bunch of different people to sort of figure out where it is that you want to go, not just in the 1 or 2 years after school, but, in the next 5, 10, 15 years, because I think, and I know some of the questions that have come through have asked about pivoting. And I think, all of us probably had very clear goals and ideas of what we were going to do with the rest of our lives when we applied. And then a lot of times that changed. It changed for me while I was at the GSB, and then it changed again 5 years after, and it changed again 5 years after that. And so it's good to kind of have all of those skills and experience from the GSB that you can draw on.
Okay. Anything else that you would do differently, anyone at the GSB, knowing what you know now?
I didn't do a global study trip. I regret that. That's already been mentioned.
All right. Well, maybe we'll pivot off of what Emily just was talking about with career pivots. So we do have some questions here about All of you mentioned that in one way or another, the Stanford GSB has offered an opportunity to pivot from your old career path into a new one. Looking back now, did you know exactly what you wanted to end up in post MBA, kind of in your current role now, and how you would leverage your GSB degree to get there? Or was this sort of an unplanned, serendipitous process that led you to where you are? So does anyone want to talk about their path or the pivot?
I can chime in and you want to go ahead, Jackie?
No, I can go after you.
Okay, so I wouldn't say necessarily when I went to GSB, I made this pivot that I wanted to become a writer, right? And to be clear, after this last year, I definitely don't want to be a full-time writer. But what I will say is that during GSB, it made me more confident to take risks with my career. And a lot of that has to do with what Jack and Sam said earlier, the culture where you saw people taking these risks, where people felt comfortable talking about failures and failing at startups and coming back. And so that's something where, that made me decide to leave publishing for a period of time, feeling comfortable that I knew that world well enough that if I had something that was worthy of being published, even if maybe there's a 1% chance of that happening or less, that I was comfortable taking those odds on with, what I believed I had, and being comfortable that I can recover if things don't work out. And so I think like that makes me more comfortable even now as I'm transitioning, right? You could argue, do I even know what I want to do 20 years from now? I would honestly say that I wouldn't be able to predict that at the moment, but I am comfortable that no matter what happens, based on my track record, based on my GSB experience, that I'll be able to bounce back from it. And I think that's one of the biggest things that GSB taught me about pivots is, yes, there are all the tactical things that you can do. There are the steps that you can take. Like I won a short story competition run by The Guardian and by HarperCollins before I decided to take time off, right? I actually got into my top tier MFA program and I'm about halfway done. It's a remote one, so I can do it during work. But I built support networks around me. And so there are tactical ways in which GSB helped me think about these things. So I do things systematically. But I think the biggest thing is the courage to be able to do pivots because you see other people doing it. It becomes a little less daunting and helps you build that confidence.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And for me, there was a lot of serendipity that led to finding new passions in grad school. When I applied, I probably thought I wanted to work for a foundation and international development. And now what I'm doing is completely different because I had several personal experiences in grad school that made me really passionate about ending sexual assault and creating a more equal culture. I started business school and a month into it, the Me Too movement kicked off. So all of those things impacted my career very much. And then we were thinking about a question earlier about like how to prepare for a career in a non-traditional path, but I think it's really about finding your passions. And then when people see you doing what you're passionate about, others notice your excitement and possibility and get on board. I also feel that right now I'm 2 years out of GSB, but I'm preparing for another career pivot where I've been a social entrepreneur and founded a couple of nonprofits, but I realized recently that I'm really passionate about writing and that there's a few books that I want to write. Some are about law and I don't have a law degree. And in my professor that I mentioned earlier from the writing class is really supportive of me going into investigative journalism. And I didn't know any of that. I didn't really know any professional writers. So it's cool hearing your story too, Yiming. But I've been just putting in place the foundations to apply to different fellowships or to try to structure my finances to figure out how to do writing. And while I didn't do a ton of writing other than that class during the GSB, I definitely echo that you develop this sense that anything is possible. You develop the sense that you can learn new skills and that you can dive into a new area, because every day at the GSB, it feels like you can just create whatever you want to create because you're seeing people that are doing that every day.
Maybe pivoting off of something that Jackie said, and I think Yiming, you also talked about it, maybe having some interest in the ed school. And let's see, we've got Sam who did the law degree, the joint degree. How did any of you leverage other parts of Stanford University, either taking classes there or connecting with students or programs or talks? Talk a little bit more broadly about your Stanford-wide experience.
Yeah, I'll just briefly share the sort of the joint degree perspective. I think felt like maybe a quarter or a fifth of my class were joint degrees and with a ton of different stuff. So it's pretty easy once you get to Stanford to apply to do a joint degree in almost any other school. They all combine neatly with the business school. So you get to take some cross classes. There's a community of people who are doing that. So there was the MD MBAs, many of them were doctors now, the JD MBAs, there were PhD MBAs, which seems insane to me. But there was a huge mix, and the school, Stanford, I think much more than most universities, really is integrated there in a way that the departments work together to coordinate stuff and made the scheduling easy. And so for anyone who's considering that, just know it was made really easy to do it, and a lot of folks get to school and then add that.
Maybe one last super quick question in our last minute or so. What is an experience that you could have only had at Stanford?
I definitely think the experience of hearing hundreds of classmates share about the most vulnerable experiences of their lives and be so supportive, for me, was transformational. There's such a culture of vulnerability at the GSB and of true support. And I just thought, okay, my classmates will support all my other classmates' topics, but I really honestly went into my talk thinking everyone's going to hate me after I give a talk about female sexuality for 40 minutes. And actually it was the opposite. Everyone was so supportive, and I felt like I belonged at the GSB because it really created a feeling of being accepted.
Do want to recognize that we are getting to, the end of our session here. And I want to thank all of our panelists for sharing your perspectives today in your various fields. I think there's just tremendous diversity represented in your backgrounds and your experiences. And again, it just highlights how wonderfully flexible this MBA degree and educational experience is. I also want to thank all of our attendees today for your interest in Stanford. We hope that this is just the start of your Stanford GSB journey, and we definitely invite you to continue it. One great thing you can do is go to mystanford.mba if you haven't been there already. You can create a personalized dashboard by taking a really quick quiz, and that will help you learn a little bit more about students or alumni who might have similar interests as you do, events that are coming up. If you start an application, it'll track your application progress along the way. So just lots of wonderful opportunities to continue to learn more about Stanford at mystanford.mba. Again, thank you to everyone for attending today, and best of luck in your journey for an off the beaten path career. Thank you.